The next thing we're moving to is a panel, but it's less about a panel and more about people jumping up and coming out here than having you all sit up the front. And we're going to ask our key kind of representatives, if you like, 3 questions. And so they've had these questions to think about. And the first question are, what does the data affirm in your area of work? Secondly, what is surprising? And thirdly, as researchers say, where would you like to do some more research or more in-depth analysis? How do you, some of the issues already that our colleagues talked about saying, look, we had a look at this, but it was a bit surprising, so we need to do more work. So here's our opportunity to say, I know you want to do more work on that, but can you also do a bit more work on this one? So I'm going to ask you, because we've had a lot of talking to you so far, but I'm going to ask our colleagues to kind of jump up, run out the front and answer those 3 questions, and I'll introduce them as a bunch and then they can come in this order. So the first one, Simone Walker. So while Simone's making her way out here, Simone Walker is from VACS. Karen Boland, the Children's Guardian, she'll come after Simone. Deidre Cheers will come after Karen. She's the Chairperson of ACWA. Steve Kinmond, our Deputy Ombudsman, he'll come after Deidre. Tim Ireland, the new, I think, CEO of AbSec, who'll come then. And is Maree here? Maree from Create. And we have someone from carers, connecting carers as well, and they can throw in some questions. So Simone, followed by Karen.
Thanks, Maree. I'm not sure if I'm answering the questions all in the right order, but I guess there's a couple of things that I just had jumped out of me, and also in some of the discussions that I'd had with FACSA prior to now. So just one of the things is about the less formal and informal support for relative and kin carers, despite the greater level of need that's experienced in those families. And I think that is a known anecdote, certainly inside the department. But the implications for the department, given our permanency principles and given the fact that we are really clear about our preference for rel and kin care, certainly over long-term PR to the Minister, I think that as a finding in itself has huge implications for what is the practice changes, and not just practice changes, that actually if these families are experiencing a greater level of need, are we going to where the need is, rather than possibly servicing foster carers? And is that about a comfort thing? Is it about something inside our work with our caseworkers? But I think that for me is a real standout, that it'd be really interesting to work with some of our district colleagues about what drives where we see the need, and actually what's happening in reality. So that's just the first one that I wanted to raise. The second one is just that absolute confirmation that none of our kids sit in a closed system. Often when we talk about outcomes for kids in out-of-home care, we talk about the health outcomes, the education outcomes, how they did at school, and the absolute vitality of the relationship between the carer and the child, I think, really comes through in this study. And often we don't make that very solid connection, even about the long-term outcomes. And a couple of weeks ago was Foster Care Week, and I was up at one of the Catholic agencies up north, and the carer who'd cared for 30 years, 100 kids, like one of those very long-term foster carers, saying that when she came to care, what she wanted to do was save children, and she felt that birth parents had had their turn and that they were out of the picture, and she said openly that she demonised them, but that over those years of caring, what became really clear is that kids need that relationship with their birth family where it's safe to do so. It doesn't have to result in restoration, but actually that's the job of a carer, is to really hold that relationship and grow it where they can. And when I see these results, I think that's so clear to us. And she said every new carer she meets, she says, your job is to love this child, but also to help build that relationship. And I think that really comes through in the research. The other thing, just 2 more things, sibling contact and some of the work we've been doing with Western Sydney about very, very large families coming into care, families with 8, 9 kids, even 6 kids. Do we have a system that caters for those families? I don't think we do. And how do we, especially when we know sibling contact is something that the kids are calling out for, what can we think about differently? And just the work that we've done in the last couple of weeks, thinking about demand drivers in the system, characteristics of the system, in our conversations with Treasury and also government, is intergenerational care. So knowing in 2013 FACSAR did some really interesting work that they put together about kids in the care system whose parents had had experiences with child protection or experiences in the out-of-home care system. You know, we're up to 20,022 kids in the total out-of-home care population. We've had a 5.7% growth in the last year. So what does that growing cohort tell us about the next generation's experience? And, you know, when we think about leaving care and the work that we need to start doing early with those kids, is how do we target, because I think it has to be targeted work, with the right kids in the system when we're thinking about the next generation of kids coming in. So.
Great, thanks. We'll keep going and then we'll take them all. You can start to answer them all together.
Sorry.
Karen? Oh, okay, sorry, Louise. Sorry, Louise. So Louise Coe from the Children's Guardian.
Hi everyone. I guess a lot of that information that we were presented this morning is not that unpredictable for us in what we find. So as a regulator, we're looking at what's happening in the agencies, which are then focusing on children. But what I thought was good today, which confirmed what we're seeing in the agencies is not working particularly well, is the involvement of the birth parents. And yesterday at the Create Forum, I think it was very telling to hear the kids talking about, in that older cohort, how important their birth parents are, particularly after they leave care, and who they have those connecting relationships with. So I would say with designated agencies to focus more on the requirements with birth parents and getting them involved in the decision-making process. What I'd like more information on in terms of the data, when we're looking at the kinship care and the foster cares, is that 65% of the relative carers are not working. And I guess what that means for kids in households where there's parents not working, I think that has flow-on effects, and I'd like more information about that. It's interesting, we knew there were differences with kinship carers as opposed to foster carers, but I guess the extent today was quite surprising on the involvement with external agencies and the support that they receive. And I guess what I'd like to know is whether kids in relative care, we're told that they stay there longer, but are they faring better overall than kids in general foster care? Because that seems to suggest that they have less support, less involvement with caseworkers, and yet the kids might be doing better. And the other issue is with, I'd like to see a greater focus on the caseworker relationships. So where kids, like yesterday again at the Create Forum, they talked about kids being, they had positive experience when they had an excellent caseworker basically. So looking at how kids feel about their caseworker and how much support they get and how often that changes. The other thing is that the kids coming into care, I know this is the first wave, but I'm interested to see in future waves how those kids are faring, because obviously there's a trauma when you come into care, but then how they're faring each 18-month cohort on. So I think that's about it. But it's all very interesting, and I think today, combined with yesterday where we're hearing from kids of their actual experiences, we're getting a picture, and I think we're getting a picture where we need to do more work and where agencies need to focus their attention. And as I said, involving kids in the decision making and parents, birth parents, and keeping them informed are sort of key when we're looking at child focused services. Thank you.
Thank you. Deidre, followed by Steve.
Hello everyone, and Wendy Foot from ACWA is here, sitting there behind me. So, and I'm ACWA Chair at the moment, which is why I'm standing here talking on behalf of ACWA. So if I just preface what I'm going to say with reaffirming ACWA's role, which is basically about advocacy for children and front of mind. We also have in the policy environment this fabulous work, rich data set, started almost simultaneously with our transition of foster care from government to non-government, so I think we need to have that in our mind. And also, of course, the legislative changes that went through a year ago. And so translating the research to the New South Wales policy environment, I think needs to actually keep particularly those latter two things front of mind in the way that we actually use the data that's going to be generated from this. So the things I want to say, I guess, are not so much in a response to the brief presentations that we've had, but some more general comments around the three areas, and having had the privilege of seeing the report, for a week or so. I think that there's a lot to be done and asked in the area of the age range of the children. So, it's the study's reflecting broadly what we've got in the care population, but we need to be very careful to look very closely at the needs, of course, of the young care leavers and the older cohort that have got a particular set of issues. This is a lot of very young children, and we need to be able to use that data going forward beyond this study to test outcomes over time, because what we see, or what I see in that younger age cohort, is that they've had pretty good stability in that first early period, but what we know practice-wise from the broader system and from previous research is that that's not necessarily reflected over time. So I would like to see the data used going forward to actually test out some of our assumptions about young children and the things that people have already commented on and said around purpose of care and purpose of contact. So some look at program specificity, looking at where the placement was, government and non-government, and I don't at all know whether that's, presumably it is going to be available from this data set. But also, and just highlighting the things that have just been said about contact, there is some need for further looks going forward at outcomes in relation to identity and placement stability, and that very front end of 0 to 3-year-olds and 0 to 5-year-olds is very, very crucial in that respect. I noted in the broader report when I was looking at it that there is a potential to look at the lack of specificity for care. So that issue of what sort of carer is what sort of carer. 25% of those younger age children were placed with carers who are classified as emergency carers, but were still there at the time of the Wave 1 interview. So what is that going to tell us going forward about stability for those children?
Thank you. Steve, followed by Tim.
Great, I'll try and be very brief. Okay, in terms of the things that I noted, in terms of what it affirmed, in terms of obviously older kids and in particular kids coming into care when they're older, and really that critical question, what do we need to do better to support these kids? Noted the issue of caseworkers and also affirms our work and the work of many others in terms of the low caseworker contact, in particular in relation to kinship care. But it's the same point that I noted that Louise raised. The issue of frequency is perhaps not the only issue. The question is, what is helpful caseworker contact? And obviously that looks at that you can cut that data a number of ways. So we think that that's an issue that certainly is worthwhile exploring moving forward. More broadly, we note that the variables, once again, can be cut in many ways. And this is more about process moving forward, I think. And look, there's a combination of factors which can impact on children's outcomes. So I'm keen for us to collectively have opportunities to consider what are the variables that ought to be examined moving forward, because there are literally thousands of them. And what particular combinations of variables should be examined. And that's tied in with, well, from a social policy point of view, what are we trying to achieve out of this exercise? And of course that, related to that then is, as this moves forward, you'll get indications of evidence which need to be fed to CARA, need to be fed to ACWA, which need to be fed to AbSec and more broadly, because we want to start looking in more detail at the practice implications and testing these things on the ground. So what I would strongly recommend, and it was suggested earlier this morning, that we have an ongoing conversation about what areas need to be looked at in more detail, what data needs to be cut, in what ways, because what assumptions do we need to be testing. So you know, as a body involved in reviewing the delivery of community services, let me put that plea. And it's a fantastic team that's been assembled, so thank you for your work to date. Regarding service efficacy, and I'll finish with this, for good reasons, what's been explored to date is only general. However, once the data, particularly your baseline data, really starts to firm up, then the potential implications in terms of service efficacy might be quite significant. For example, in broad social policy terms, will kids in out-of-home care fare worse than kids who are restored, than kids who are placed, who are adopted, or kids who are placed under guardianship? I mean, that's the assumption under which we're operating, but obviously that's an issue that this exercise could test over time. What types of service arrangements are providing better outcomes for kids? Once again, this data should enable some reasonably firm conclusions to be reached in that regard. And then what other service systems, universal services and mainstream services, does the data indicate make a difference in terms of kids' outcomes, particularly when it's delivered in a particular way? So there are a few issues that moving forward we'd be interested in exploring together with you. Thanks very much.
Okay. Tim, followed by Maria.
Good morning, everyone. I guess just as a general overview or starting point, I'd say it's great to see all this preliminary data coming forward and where it could actually go. And specifically, just touching on what Maree was talking about, that we're going to see more of an Aboriginal specific kind of case study around how Aboriginal kids are going to be faring in the system and things like that. I guess what it affirms for me is the role of relationships and siblings being such an important factor as a child grows into adulthood. And going forward, I guess just a few things around what we would kind of, or what I find surprising is the access to informal and formal supports for kinship carers, and to really explore that a bit more as to why kinship carers are not, particularly informal supports, why they're not accessing informal supports as much, particularly within their Aboriginal kinship carers, within their communities, or even differentiating between Aboriginal kinship care and just general kinship care, and what that looks like. Going forward, the characteristics of caseworkers and what provides for a better outcome is probably something that needs to be explored a bit more. Ensuring, looking into and exploring those kind of cultural connections and the cultural rights for Aboriginal children and young people, and how that impacts on better outcomes over time, and particularly recognising that as an Aboriginal child grows into adulthood, the relationships that they need to form, being an adult, or come across naturally when within whatever professional role they take on or anything like that, even if they have lack of identity as they're growing older, the importance that plays as part of their identity and forming themselves longer term, and even intergenerational kind of impacts on that as well. And then exploring those kind of additional supports or those changing supports that are needed for carers, particularly carers from low socioeconomic backgrounds like Aboriginal carers, Aboriginal kinship carers, and what are the kind of changing supports either within a holistic or integrated kind of service delivery model that enables greater stability of a placement over time. Yeah.
Hey, hi, good morning everyone. I'm Maree, I'm the Acting State Coordinator for Create Foundation, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to comment on such a really important body of work. So today I'd like to respond not so much again to the presentations that were here today, but more so to what I picked up from the report about the voices of children and young people in care and their experiences. So it's really interesting that Create actually did our own study in 2013 where we sampled across Australia about 1,069 young people in care, and in New South Wales there's comprised of 309 young people, and for us it's actually the opposite in terms of our sample, where the majority of our sample, over 50%, were fell into the 10 to 14-year-old age range. So it's certainly really interesting to see what older children are seeing, even though they're not exactly the same cohort. And the average time that they've been in care is about 9 to 10 years, so it's really interesting to kind of see how they fared. So in terms of what the data affirmed about our area of work at Create is that firstly that young people's experiences with caseworkers and their interaction with the department remains really inconsistent and mixed. I know that from the report that the majority, I guess 40% were generally dissatisfied with their caseworkers, and then that really is similar to what we found, where young people felt that 40% didn't feel that they could contact their caseworkers as often as they needed, and only 9% could confide in their caseworkers if they had any issues. And I know that from our anecdotal evidence, where we consult with groups of young people every month, they also say that some really have excellent caseworkers, but also some don't see their caseworkers enough, or they feel they don't get enough support from their caseworkers, or that their caseworkers broke promises or really didn't listen to them. The second point about the preliminary kind of data that affirms the work that we're doing is that school really remains a significant concern for young people, and it's a domain which really affects their well-being and their experience in care. I know that you guys found that close to half of 12 to 17-year-olds rarely or never or only sometimes enjoy being at school, although I'm interested to know the reasons why. But from the research that we've done, we know that a quarter report being bullied at school, and anecdotally we know that it's due to the stigma attached to being in care, where if the caseworker comes to school, their friends find out, they get teased, they lose friends, they feel this huge amount of pressure to hide the fact that they're in care. Thirdly, what it's affirmed about our area of work is that children in residential care need more support. So I know that in the report it was flagged that children in residential care experience poorer well-being than children in other placement types, and we've certainly found that in our own research as well, where they did tend to experience higher suspension rates, less involved in physical activity, more likely to be split up from siblings, and less likely to maintain friendships. And from residential care workers, I know in the report they said that they felt that they knew the children less well than, say, foster carers or kinship carers, and I think that speaks to systemic issues about the high turnover rates in residential care, which our young people certainly bring up often. In terms of what the data we found surprising was that I think in the report, over half of 12 to 17-year-olds had actually been involved in developing their case plan. Whereas we found in our own research that less than a third knew about their case plan, and there's a lack of participation, particularly in New South Wales. But I wonder if perhaps that reflects a cultural shift within the department, where maybe more caseworkers these days receive more training about consulting with young people. And finally, the areas in which we would like to see more in-depth analysis is on measures of emotional well-being for children and young people. We find that when we consult with children and young people, when we ask an open question for them to raise their concerns about their lives and what they're most worried about, they're most worried about having a say in what goes on in major decisions in their lives, the need for significant people around them to listen to them, and really a sense of control and freedom in their lives, as well as access to information. What I'd like to see is, a measure in the study that looks at, do children feel that they're consulted? Do they have a sense of control over their frequency of contact with their caseworkers? What's their relationship like with their caseworkers? And what type of meaning they make from being in care, where a lot of them feel that they're not wanted? Were they told why their placement broke down? Many aren't. Many aren't told why they're in care, and so they feel that they're scared to make the same mistake as their parents, or they feel that there's something wrong with them, that it's their fault, and they've really internalised a lot of those meanings that they've constructed due to the lack of information and transparency from the people in their lives. I'd also like to see more research perhaps done into the stigma attached to being in care, particularly around the school environment, as we know that impacts significantly on young people's ability to make friends, maintain friendships, feel a sense of ease in the world. And finally, as you know, Create has done a lot of work around sibling contact recently. So what we'd like to see is, over the long term, whether how the contact with siblings is maintained or played out, especially with the new reforms in adoption. If siblings are adopted out, what does that mean for family contact? Do they still maintain contact with their siblings? Do they feel excluded from this new family that's been formed? So we're certainly interested in the importance of sibling contact to young people in care, especially, and echoing the research, we know that siblings are the most frequently contacted family members for children and young people, even when they're not living with them. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we've got some time to open up and to hear from yourselves about what are research questions that you have, and also a little bit of exploration from our colleagues here also about other things that you might be wanting to ask. So let's take any questions. Yeah, Sue.
Sue Tregeagle from Bernardo's. It's a question mainly to Judy, but the others may like to be involved as well. And it was touched on by Steve and Deidre and Maree a little bit. But I'm after this question of, are you looking at relationships related to whether it becomes a care plan for adoption or an actual adoption? And are you able to differentiate that in your data set at the moment? And it's going to be very important going forward with the changes to the legislation.
I think the answer is yes with the linked data.
Sorry, Judy, can I get you to stand up and spin around? Yeah.
I might have to call on colleagues, but yes, no, my understanding is that we would be looking at that because we will have access and linkage to the kids' data, for example, and that will pull that in. That's correct, right? You want to follow up too?
I'm just trying to, I think we have a reason for exit, and that we should have adoptions on it. There's not very many that take, when we started, that seems to take a few years to get adopted, but maybe if it goes on, we will get that, and we'll be able to link that back in with the interview data.
I was actually trying to make 2 points. One is the actual adoption, the other is where the care plan changes of the placement is with potentially adopted parents. So, it's quite, there are a few other points on that scale.
Well, I think that would make, the care plans would be in the kids' data, so it would be able to be pulled out from it.
Some of it, you could look in detail, but most of what we're getting is just what case workers, because there's the 4,100, it's not the detailed care plan, even though that's accessible, but that's scanned in as a care plan. It's not really a little square where you can say, but there is a little square saying, yeah, for adoption, this is going for adoption now, this child has been adopted, but there isn't how, the care plan itself isn't bureaucratised, I guess, into data.
The care plan that goes to the Children's Court is as far as I'm aware, PR to the Minister of Restoration. So the detail, and I think this is a really important point, and it may not be possible here, but I think it needs to get on the page because there are care plans to the court being written that actually teach the vets and go, PR to the Minister to 18 under the adoption question. Yes, adoption would be suitable, particularly if it's a very small child, and then under restoration, should things change in the future. Like, go through that. It would be very helpful to have some kind of trend data on this, because that's a practice implication.
Well, we will get that with the court data.
We're looking at that with the court data.
So we will get that, but it won't be on 4,000.
No.
But it might be on 100.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, or 100.
Yeah.
Great.
No, we will have a sample that will deal with it in the court data.
Yep.
we're
I mean, it would be
particularly
good,
looking at that.
I would suggest going forward and following up on my point about where are the bulk of the children in this study, look at the front end. Don't, not that 15 to 7-year-olds aren't important and I don't want to be disrespectful, but let's look at the front end and those very little ones that are pouring in.
And follow them when they go home.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, Maree?
Hi, I'm Mary from Love Without Barriers. I've just been travelling around New South Wales visiting all our child and family staff, and I'm really interested in the regional differences. And I'm interested in everything, but also the service density and variety that's available in the town in the other sectors that are important, paediatricians, psychiatrists, those sorts of things, to see if there's any difference in the outcomes about the construction of the service system. When you say, there was yesterday, orange, you know, where they've only got a fly in, fly out, you know, psychiatrist, for example, you might have kids with severe issues in residential care and your access to sort of people is quite limited. So, interested in everything, fabulous, congratulations to everybody, but that's just front of mind. And then I have a second one, if I might, which might be in the reports you'll talk about that are coming, Maree, but it's really the severity and type of abuse that the child has suffered before they enter care. Because I'm observing just really in this operational role that children settle for quite a long time, and then in upper primary and puberty, things happen where that was not expected in very stable placement. My hypothesis is it relates to the abuse that the child's had a long time ago, and that it emerges sometimes 5 or 6 years later. And if we knew more about that, we might, to the seemingly settled and happy child, call more attention in earlier. So I'll be very interested in that.
So let's take those two questions. Do any of the researchers want to have a jump in terms of any early look that they've done at either regional differences or indeed, I know we know this is a prospective study, but experiences prior to entry into care?
Well, just to say that we will, as I said, we will be looking at...
Elan, how about you stand up and turn it? Sorry.
We will be looking at the differences between urban, regional and remote. Whether we'll be able to look at specific areas like Orange versus Wagga Wagga or whatever, that I don't think so, because we probably won't have numbers in specific areas. And I think facts you said that you were doing a district by district analysis, so you would be able to look at different parts of the state. But one of the factors that you have to take into account when you're looking at access to services is geographical location, so that is something we need to look into. In terms of your other one, I mean, and this is also the case with the adoption, one of the issues with a study like this is that although it looks like huge numbers, when you get down to things that only happen to a small number, so it might be, you know, so for managers, I know it's a big concern when placements break down, for example, but we'll have, I mean, it's an empirical question that we'll have to look at to see how many of those actually happen. And where you've got small numbers of children going through a particular pathway, then it's quite difficult to do, when you can do an analysis of it, but from a statistical point of view, it's quite difficult when you've got small numbers in a particular category. And I think in adoption, we're going to have small numbers, just because of when the cohort came into care. You know, if we started the cohort now, you would have had bigger numbers, and so we could have done it.
I just had an answer to that, because I think we've got, so far got 6 in 4,106 maybe, or maybe that's in 1285, 1285 that are coming up for adoption, so it's a very small, so it's reiterating that real point, but it's going to be small. And the other thing, we just had a very quick look, so very preliminary about number of reports, and for the older, like, for the younger children have less reports, and they haven't had time, you know, but so there wasn't much correlation between that and the outcome, so they're just really coming in. But for the older children, it looked like the correlation between the number of reports and the child behaviour problem in CBCL was like 0.83, so really high. And I think too, that my hunch is too, that this early
frequency, severity of reporting will be a better predictor of their long-term outcomes than less heavily terrible experience.
So I'm going to jump in and ask a question myself, or, around that, because it seems a bit of contradiction to me that we have 47% of the 12 to 17-year-olds in the clinical range in the Uppenbach, but the carers' perception of them that they're doing pretty well. And I wonder, I wonder, what is that difference? Are they being, the rule of optimism, things will always get better, they seem better than they are, that in the clinical tests tell us. And I'm curious about, is that also happening for our being the sectors, caseworkers? Do we think they are travelling better than actually if we used evidence-based testing? The test would tell us actually they're not doing so well. And so,
Well, comment on that one. There's an issue that came up, similar comments were made a number of years ago with that well-known paper by Michael Sawyer, and he published in the Medical Journal of Australia. I think Michael showed that about 60% of the children whose sample in South Australia were scoring in the clinical range in the CBCL. And the interesting thing about Michael's sample was he didn't sample very many residential care kids, and he pretty much sampled kids who were bed stability levels much above the average of the rest of the sample in South Australia. So even in a group of very stable children, you get 60% scoring the clinical range. Now, a few sort of talks I've made in the past, and I've upset a few people talking about, as I said, that particularly clinical psychs, I said that you have to distinguish between the clinical significance of a classification and practical significance. In other words, the clinical threshold might be here, and this says this child needs professional psychological help. You probably have to be about here before it really makes a difference, makes that child very hard to place. In other words, you can score, and some in the gambling field too, certain these measures you can get in the clinical range, and you can score such that the child's different needs to see needs ongoing support. But there's a big difference between a child who has all those sort of difficult behaviours and a child who's doing very serious things like setting fire to houses and petting pets and various other really dangerous behaviours which put other kids at risk. And so we found, looking at we did an audit of all about 200 cases in South Australia, and we found that it's about 20% of the sample were really hard to place, and they had really extreme behaviours which made them really very unstable and hard to place. But there were a lot of other kids who'd score in the clinical range in CBCL, but still the carers could deal with that level of behaviour. So I think distinguishing between the clinical and the practical placement relevance of the behavioural problems probably is relevant. That might be we need to look at some rash type modelling or something, looking at the type of behavioural problems which they're scoring on the CBCL. Might be the certain. We found, for example, sexualised behaviours in particular. One of those might be enough to make that child very hard to place versus about 10 of tantrums and various other standard norms of behaviours. So that's my general take on that.
thank you very much. Other questions and points to make here? Yes, Wendy.
Just a question about what we might know about supporting children in the education system through the study, particularly thinking about knowledge in other areas, in early childhood education, for example, that talks about the importance of providing interventions in that preschool age group. So I'm thinking about that, and are we going to be looking at this data in relation to what does it tell us about what children need in order to be able to engage in the education system when they've got things going on in their lives and they're hard to concentrate.
Okay, question about the education, and then we'll come to you, Rita. So I think that one, they're taking that as a comment.
I don't
yes.
know whether anyone particularly had this, but because I did pore over it, the rate of preschool and early childhood for 3 to 5
very high,
is incredibly high. in this
Fantastic,
group,
yeah.
Incredibly high. Higher than the New South Wales
That's
norm,
right,
and New
yeah.
South Wales is low compared to other states and territories. So there's some really interesting stuff there around, well, why is that?
Yes, yeah.
Child protection measure.
Yeah. And then the matching one is, well, did the birth parents have access to that same rate of early childhood and as a child protection school?
Rita.
Hi, I'm Rita Fennick from Connecting Carers New South Wales. I'd just like to make a couple of comments about what I've heard here today. One of them was to acknowledge the process that the carers went through with the good people that undertook this research. They felt respected. They felt the process was very easy and made easy for them, user-friendly, were their words. So on behalf of the carers, thank you. That's the positive feedback that we've received. The other comment I'd like to make about the difference that foster carers and kinship carers feel. We work on the ground and what we hear continuously is that the kinship carers, the placement of their children in their care has come as a shock to them, whereas the foster carers have preparation in receiving children into their homes. So that is a really big thing for kinship carers. So we try, and so that's why they feel that they're very different from each other. So we try to actually cater for the kinship carers because, and that's a lot around shame and guilt and grief and loss. So a lot of our work with the carers is around that. But can I say to you, there is many occasions where they do come together and they value the networking they do with each other, and that is in the family camps that we undertake, etc. So although there are those differences and we are proactively looking after those differences, there is that coming together of both where they share and that is valued. And the other thing is, I'd like to make a comment on the whole community that I think it was you that commented on. You didn't understand why they felt so supported. About 15 years ago, Community Services put together a multicultural foster care team, and the Turkish, Arabic and Vietnamese communities have their own networking, their own support group where they have education in their own language and support in their own language. 7 years ago, we partnered with Community Services and we delivered that education and support to the carers in partnership with the multicultural team. So that is why that cohort of core communities feel so supported, because they are supported within their group, within their community, and with their own culture and language identified. So that's why.
Great, thank you. Any other points or questions or surprises? Larry, followed by Jessica.
A thing we talked about the other day when we sort of had a pre-briefing on it was one of the things we were really good in facts is going, there's a problem, we better fix that problem, and looking at the things that are wrong. There's a whole lot of stuff in there, and it was kind of framed, it was problematised in the way it was framed. There was actually a lot of things where the majority were doing well in things, and it would be a useful thing if we could go what works, and if we could build on what works as much as goes actually what isn't working. So I think my plea would be, and I'm sure we will, to bring some of that stuff out about what are we doing well and what can we improve on.
Is there any comment about that? It's a bit like Deidre going, my gosh, we're getting these kids to childcare. We know how important childcare is for children's development, that the researchers want to make.
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment. I probably wouldn't frame it quite like that either. This is baseline. This is wave one. So I don't think it will tell us what we're doing right or what we're doing wrong yet.
Yeah.
It tells us about what's the situation that we're being delivered with, if you like, the circumstances of children at this early stage, very shortly after they've entered into the out-of-home care system on a final order. I think it's when we get to wave 2, 3, 4 that we're really going to be able to say, and are the things that we're putting in place as a service system changing that and making that better or making that worse. I don't think we can tell from wave 1.
Oh no, and I agree we can't, but I guess Darryl, my point is
Yeah.
when the data's presented, it says X% of kids are doing badly, as opposed to the headline being Y% are doing well. And sometimes
Sure.
Y was bigger than X. So
Yeah, I beg to differ in that, you know, I think we presented the number of children where there were no problems. You know, so, but I take your point that we have to make sure that we do emphasise that. And my point that I tried to make was we need to make sure that we don't have any unanticipated consequences, that we want to make sure that we continue to have that proportion where there are no problems, or, you know, no physical health problems, or no children in the clinical range. We don't want to create changes to the service system whereby we disrupt that. But more importantly, as we get to wave 2 and 3 and 4, we want to make sure that we're on a positive trajectory rather than a negative one. I think the challenge will be, while we see greater numbers of children who have problems, or lower numbers of children who don't have problems when they're entering into care at the older age group, the younger age group are going to be moving into that older age group. So is it a developmental trajectory thing where, because of the abuse that also might have been happening very early on for those older kids, but we just didn't detect them as a service system, it's a possibility, you know, a theory, that those children are going to be also developing those greater number of problems. So I think there are some real challenges for the service delivery system.
Elan, followed by
Just to make one point about that as well, that our comparison between, maybe we should have said this, when we compare with community norms, you're comparing with the average Australian child, and obviously children coming into care are not the average Australian child. So as we move on, what we'll try and do is to match those children with equivalent children who are not in care rather than the average, because it's an unfair comparison to compare children in foster or kinship care with the Australian average. So
1 minute, Maree.
Thank you. I'm really interested in the impact of externalizing behaviours and analyses. I'm just not wanting to make this sound too simple, the comparison, but you mentioned that kids in relative care have lower rates of externalizing behaviours, and that kids in kinship care have higher rates of links with family, contact with biological family. Are you actually going to be looking at whether the impact of in connection with biological family has anything to do with externalizing behaviour?
Yeah, that's the sort of thing we can look at. One of the things, for example, I think...
Paul, do you just want to repeat the question, just for those of us catching up with the externalising, internalising?
Yeah, the question was really to do with whether its causality is whether the actual family contact with biological parents may be in some ways, you know, a cause of externalising behaviours, or whether. So we could look. Or even a protective factor. So one of the things you could look at. Obviously, the longitudinal data, you can look at changes in the types and frequency of family contact with biological parents, and you can then look for changes in the externalising behaviour. So one way you can model that is to have a look at those two varying over time. And any opportunities we had to look at any sort of qualitative data in relation to the quantitative findings. I always find, I always like to use quantitative data and then link it up with the qualitative findings wherever possible, so you can sort of get certain effects occurring, like for example, you're seeing, you know, externalising behaviours being worse in relation to very frequent contact. Any sort of qualitative, that might be a very good, you know, segue into a qualitative investigation. Look at those cases. What are the young people saying? The families saying, is there in fact, is in fact in that particular case making things worse, or another case might make it better. So that's a sort of way in which I think in a perfect world, you know, research world, we've got to look at that sort of thing. But yeah, certain opportunities that are very good things looking at.
Marina?
I was just going to say, in terms of Maree's comment, we will be looking at pathways of children. So say children are doing really well at baseline, we can look at those individuals and see how they're tracking, like are they improving more or staying the same or getting worse. So we do that for all different types of pathways. We're not just looking at these big aggregated numbers, we will be looking at individuals' pathways and the factors that are influencing improvements, declines.
Dara?
Just a few things I'd be interested to see, but I take your point about statistical significance. Kids' contact with the criminal justice system, ranging from, you know, whether the police warnings all the way through Commission brings to mind issues around experience of kids in care and whether they're experienced sexual abuse in care and whether there's a difference between kids in resi care and kids in foster care situations. The issue of homelessness, we talk about placement breakdowns, but whether kids actually end up, it breaks down to the point where they're homeless and not in contact with any foster carers. And then the point of adoption is being touched on a fair bit, but I'd be interested to kind of delve into whether when a kid's in a foster care situation, whether the family's thought about adoption as an option, whether they've been given any support or information about how they could go about adoption, or how the kid in fact would feel about the prospect of being adopted within that placement.
So a couple there for a couple of people. Elan, do you want to start on the what we were talking last night actually about the...
So the linked data aspect of it, which we haven't even touched on here, that is going to really be exciting in terms of being able to look at not only the justice system but the health system, for example, and we'll have a much better sense. For example, a lot of the questions about service access were based on people's recollections, and we know from other research that that's not very accurate. But if you've got linked data, we will actually know how many times they've seen a GP, how many times they've seen a psychologist, etc. And similarly, links with the police and justice system. So that is definitely in scope. And not only will we know for this cohort, we can then compare to the full cohort, etc. So I don't know, Fred, do you want to talk about that aspect? So I think that's where we're going to get the real richness of those information.
So the linked data will cover the full 4,000. And so the difference between the 4,000 and the study sample is that a large portion of the full sample left care before they were on permanent order. But we know their contact with other service systems through that linked data. So you'll be able to assess from a protective factors perspective how well did the decision to restore a child to his or her family affect the outcomes in relationship to school, criminal justice, and other service systems, as compared to the children for whom the decision was made to seek the permanent order. So you'll get a chance to see, well, what is the effect of the decision to restore versus not on these outcomes in other systems. So that'll be a very important, so you won't have the detailed information about contacts with providers and so on and so forth, but there'll be enough to work with there to sort of create a narrative that talks about how well does the out-of-home care system work relative to those kinds of decisions. And that, I think, could turn out to be as important as the more detailed primary data collection.
Right. I think we've got the adult justice data as well, so as they go out and care what happens.
We do have also a special section of the questionnaire for adoptive parents, so I can share that with you so you can see if there's any questions I'm asking.
Correct me if I'm wrong, once you get the baseline for this group, you could run a later study to look at wellbeing indicators and so on in terms of those who've been adopted and so on, and then compare that to this group. So that would be doable, for example. Yeah.
Especially with the linked data.
That's right.
Yeah.
Karen, did you have your hand up? Yep.
So I think it's partly been answered, but obviously the pathway for children, and congratulate obviously the department and the researchers on the research, and the fact that it's so child-centred. I suppose what I'm thinking is that they're moving through an institution and taking up the issue of the Royal Commission at the moment. We have an institution which is not only the pathway through the court to an order, but we also have oversight agencies, we have working with children checks, and we have accreditation, all of which are targeted at keeping children safe. So I suppose my question is to Judy about, because you're you've been around in terms
You're the
of...
grandmother.
Yeah. I'm not even a grandmother. Sorry. Yeah. I was just thinking about going back to when this regulatory frame was put in place, and
That's nice. That's a nice big question, Claire. Yeah, look, I'd actually like to take part of it on notice, give it a bit more thought. But I mean, it will come in part in terms of the intergenerational effects too, of the kids who that we're seeing now, who are the kids of parents who already were in the care system. But and I guess one of the more it's actually going to be closer to the fact of the current legislative changes that we're going to be looking at rather than those distal ones. So I think we're really looking at, as Maree said before, the impact of the changes around permanency planning, guardianship, adoption, and so on, and the transition from government to non-government. So I think it might be stretching a bit, but I'll give it some thought.
But even our data in kids goes back to 2003.
Yeah.
It does go back before, but that has all been sort of married over. But it tends to be that a lot of the databases, the big admin databases, are more recent, so it's hard to get the early data.
Lisa.
I just wondered whether it's too early to talk about the simulation model, because it is very early days, but we're building a simulation model that I think it seems to be such an overlap between what will come from this and what we'll be able to put into that model and how that will be able to predict for us, what things like policy changes might, mean for children and their trajectory through the system. It just sort of seems like there's a lot of overlap there, or a lot of powerful information that can be used in the model.
Yeah. Anna.
Thanks. We didn't get to chapter 9, to the
Your
household
favourite
characteristics that were actually in the report, and I was very interested in them. I was curious about whether or not you're going to, but it was touched on in the comparison of kinship carers and foster carers with regards to who is, levels of employment. In the report itself, it talks about housing, and when you started to talk about permanency, I started to think about the prerequisites for permanency, like security, housing, and those sorts of issues. And I wondered whether or not you were going to, in looking at care households and the characteristics, tease out whether, when it says, this group of people are paying a relatively rent, and I think that was higher for kinship carers than it was for other types of carers, whether or not they're actually in public housing or they're in private housing, and tease out some of those differences within it. Similarly with the levels of education as well in the households, because we know that maternal education counts enormously. And those things, that modelling those behaviours are really important to kids. So I wondered whether or not you were going to look at that in more depth. Housing, jobs, health, I think
we really should look at, and I'm interested in geography. I did my degree on other half of psychology was geography, so I did social geography and not geography and where they got Grand Hugo was guys, so I was very interested in that area, so that's one reason why it's all on those slides. So I find it quite interesting. I think looking at housing and the sort of structure of housing, so certainly I like to model those sort of variables and have a look at that, for sure.
Grania, and I think after Grania I might be able to take one more question, but I think we're done. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks. I think maybe Professor Hanson might be able to answer this question. So I'm curious about childhood behaviours in the early intervention. So when you are seeing the amount of help, I suppose, the frequency of professionals that are being accessed, are you actually going to look at the models of care or the intervention practices? Because there's other parallel bodies of work that do different types of interventions which have longitudinal impact. So when you're intervening in that early childhood, say, whether it's in security piece, there are two different intervention models. Are you going to capture that and got an impact?
It's very difficult to do that because the question that's asked is, in the past, I think it's a month or 6 months, have you had contact with them or just tick off the psychologist? So the exact nature of that treatment, we don't go down to that level of detail. That sort of study would have to be like a qualitative add-on to the study. So you could, you could use this study as the basis for further exploration, but in the actual questionnaire, which is already 2 hours, as Sandy said, you couldn't go down, for every service exactly what sort of service you want.
Okay, look, I think that's probably a wrap. We've got time for morning tea. Where is that? In here. So please stay and take advantage of having our research colleagues here, and if you have any individual questions or if there's anything that you want followed up, please take the opportunity to network formally and informally with our colleagues. And once again, let's give them a very big round of applause. And thanks everybody for coming.